Hello, T. Lee Logic Jones back for another fill-in video, or just an addendum, I guess, video to appendix, there we go, to the first video on Cosmological Metaphysics. This is now going to be lesson C. And I noticed in the first video I made a really clumsy edit at 2 minutes and 45 seconds in. At the time I realized my mic had cut out, which is a problem I have with my equipment, that my external microphone just drops out for reasons unknown. Sorry, I cut out of the silent part and then just began again at the next screen. And the text actually doesn't run through that roughly, but the visuals jump in, and unless you took the time to pause and sort of read through, I do clarify it somewhat, but this is intended to take the opportunity to expand on this very important issue. And this is really at the heart of much of what I do in this work, and I must admit that the driving force behind me beginning to engage in work like this, even to go to school in the first place, to find out the answers to these questions. That I must admit, in my university, I got really more confusion than I did answers. But it was after school that I began to very slowly build the skills to ask the questions which I now have asked, and some of which I have provided some kind of answer for in this struggle between the metaphysical, spiritual substance of our being and the merely physical, material substance of our being. And in this frame here, we have a little historical outline, which I want to now expand upon a little bit here. So we've got Christian ascent. We started with that historically because that's what's important to us at this time. There was a time in which Christianity ascended to the top of Western civilization, and there's a sense in which it still remains there, but in a much more modified form, for reasons which we'll now see. That during that time, the early phase of that ascent, there was a lot of establishment of being, establishment of what is real, of ontology and cosmology and anthropology. And anthropology and all under theology. Pardon my messy production values here. We never even built the fourth wall at our studio. That's how Pomo we are. So we had a Christian ascent and intellectual development under this theology, and with quite honorably slavish obeisance to theology. And they revealed that all that is truly discovered in other philosophies is true under the truth of our God, which is Jesus Christ, the eternal Logos. And it was under this development, under theology, that the Church Fathers established the firm foundation of Christian rule. And because of this sense of looking back with respect to what preceded, which was the constant mood of Christianity from its very inception, first of all looking only back to our Lord, looking forward, of course. This is not just a backward-looking thing, but in terms of building a structure, how do we respond? Well, how would they have responded, those who were closer to Christ? As if there's the knowledge that the further we get from Christ, unless we have full confidence and faith in him and are connected to that vine that goes back to him, we haven't cut ourselves off somehow, we will have lost our sense of Christian rule. But if we stay faithful to that and move forward and grow under Christian rule, that was founded on this incredible work that was done by the Church Fathers from the beginning to the up until St. John of Damascus. There was a period of solidification of Christian thinking, Christian theology on these subjects of anthropology, cosmology, and ontology, which established Christian rule through the Middle Ages. And then there was the scientific method was begun. The seeds of this idea were developed by Christian monks, by people who had some amount of leisure to think and to study and to read some of the old works, which were never banned from reading in the early days, and a basic kind of methodology for engaging in material inquiry was developed by many of these men, and also the theoretical basis for it, would be based largely on Aristotle, or at least remnants of Aristotle and other Greek philosophers, but also through this same Christian theology, anthropology, cosmology, and ontology. But this then began to be secularized, and we'll get to reasons for this secularization in a little bit here. I just want to go through the history as briefly as I can in order to establish the main points. But there was basically due to, let's list a little bit of them here. I'm going to cover this part. Yeah, this is a story that's already been told in other places, but to treat it as abstractly as possible and really from the ontology, cosmology point of view, the secularization, meaning the institutions that were developed under Christian rule, which was the university system, and all knowledge-producing institutions were Christian knowledge institutions made in the West. And through the development of the scientific method, secularization occurred because we had first Copernicus seemingly to make an argument for heliocentrism, which is not necessarily the case. In fact, he confirmed what Hildegard von Bingen had a vision of. But we'll get into that later. Newton added to this system in that he provided, at least those who followed him say that he provided a material motive for the Copernican heliocentric worldview. And this began to unseat, this unseating of Christianity through the transfer of institutions. So actually these should really be reversed. I'm sorry for that inaccuracy. So you had a transfer. Well, it's true. Both the unseating happens coming and going, because once the institutions were transferred through the secularization, that was the unseating of Christianity. And then we've gotten to Einstein and the further unraveling of anything like this kind of ontology and cosmology. And then we have, as Christians, and even as Catholics, there have been coping strategies that have been implemented in order to deal with this unseating. How will we continue to participate in the very institutions which our forebears made? And there's two ways in which we went about this. The first way of coping was simply to be cast out of the institutions, either choosing to leave, which is a form of being cast out, just simply no longer going to those institutions. So it's like a pre-casting out. This was often a coping mechanism for people to just avoid going to higher education because it was no longer Christian. And some of these people were considered ignorant, and maybe some of them were. But in some way to just simply stick to the guns, the original guns of the church, and just allow yourself to no longer fit in, to be a cast out, to be an outcast, in fact. And for the cost of being an outcast was to be accused of being ignorant, backward. That's the same. Ignorant, afraid. In a kind of Freudian sense, we were considered to be afraid, or to be, in some way, we were pathologized. Some kind of pathology involved in carrying on with this kind of ignorant, fearful state of being an outcast, because something had been discovered. And we're going to ask that question here in a second. What was discovered? What was this great intellectual victory? Because the other method of coping was, in fact, to compromise dogma. So all of this that was done here, all this work that was done, the world that was established in order to, or that was defined, that established Christian rule, and eventually brought in the scientific method, which was, when misunderstood about these things, led to the overthrow of Christian rule and the transfer of institutions, the unseating of Christianity. And then this was then to be dealt with by compromising dogma. Yeah, let's change that to pathological. It's a better parallelism. Or outcast, afraid, ignorant, afraid, or pathological. If we compromise dogma, though, then we can play in. And what have been our methods of compromising dogma? Well, the principal method, the underlying method of compromising dogma, is to defer to the material, or defer to the primacy of matter. This is probably the principal deference is to the primacy of matter. And this is a very persistent one because it is so subtle. And that I have discussed this already at some length in these videos, so I won't get into that right now in this clarification. But the other thing that we have done, the other compromise or deference that has been made, the next thing is in a sense, we reset each new inquiry to zero, which means ignorance. Ignorance of any holistic understanding, which was the absolute hallmark of the earlier cosmology. It was thoroughly infused, coming and going with meaning and with understanding. We could assume ahead of time certain things that we knew because we were coming at it from a position of faith. And now we must, each and every time we approach a thing, come out at, even if we've managed to, reestablish the existence of God somehow for ourselves. Next time we come into an inquiry, we aren't allowed to carry belief in God forward. We are forced to reset ourselves to zero each and every time. So we can't have a collective Christian understanding because we have to go back to the primacy of matter every time we start a new inquiry. So we must, in that sense, always live in their world, under their rules. And people will, there may be an outcry, well, what are you saying? What are you saying? Of course, all material inquiry must be free from God, must be free from reference to God, because it is just the material world that he made, and it works according to its own principles and such. Well, that's an assumption that's a huge assumption. That's a material assumption. that we cannot see God in the physical world other than as outside of it as its creator, which is not traditional Christianity. He is always forever infused in the material world as its creator and its sustainer. And so this is a huge compromise, that we are always unseated. We're always brought back to ignorance. Every time we engage in a new argument, we have to act as if God is not there, rather than starting with God, which is what we should be doing. And this, though, is what makes us seem ignorant, makes us told we're afraid because we can't accept the changes that have come, and this makes us pathological. Back again after a break of some days here, hoping to finish this up. I know that, what I've been presenting here is a very cursory run through this history, but this history is stated often in our culture as being the victory of science over religion. I'm not presenting, as it were, a unique story. I'm presenting the story that we have been told is the reason why we now live in a scientific and a secular scientific culture, because some victory has been wrought on the part of the secular scientist, and that has led to the overthrow and the unseating and the overthrow of Christianity and the transfer of the institutions, as we talked about before. And we showed that there are two ways in which we can kind of come to terms with this change in the unseating of Christianity. We can either choose to remain an outcast, ignorant, which has thus far earned us the titles of being ignorant, afraid, and pathological. That there's some sort of, need or wish fulfillment or whatever sort of accusations that people make against people who claim to believe in God, that the secular worldview, has to categorize them somehow. And so we're categorized in this way because we haven't moved forward. And there's this belief that has been a progression, an almost determined progression. And what I mean to show in my work is that it's actually just been a digression that we've engaged in, a dead end of inquiry in a large sense. This is not to say that all scientific study or all scientific research, all scientific knowledge is somehow false. Not at all. It just means that it is not held together in a meaningful whole anymore. And that because it lacks this telos, both the telos of Christian ontology and cosmology, but also the formalism, the metaphysical form, the divine form of being and of the cosmos and of man. We have allowed ourselves to think, as it were, outside of this world and in their world. I think I've made that point enough times for now. So the other answer was to compromise dogma. And the primary way in which we do this is we defer to the primacy of matter. That is, that we consider that matter is first. And I will say that in scientific research, matter is the first place we look, because that's the only place we can immediately see. This will be discovered in more, or discussed in more detail later. But we're not talking about deferring to the primacy matter as in primacy or the first steps of our inquiry. We're talking about that matter is of itself primary, and there is no, because it is what we see or can see, that it is all that we can know that is, and that is the fundamental error here. And so if we find that in doing so, we're constantly made to reset each inquiry to zero, to ignorance. And if we could coin a word, if this is a coining of a word, we say that we reset each inquiry to zero, which means to ignorance, and in this case, what we're meaning is to agnosis, to agnosticism. We must always begin without believing in God. And we have, as Christians and scientists, been far too okay with this state of things, as if there is no cost to our knowledge in doing so. It is to have decided to play by the rules of our enemies, and that is not a good move. Has not been a good move for us. An example of this is theistic evolution. I won't do a full takedown of theistic evolution right here. I advise anybody who is new to this controversy, because a lot of people just simply have assumed that evolution is correct, and somehow that works with Genesis, and somehow we still are Christians, faithful Christians, even if we accept evolution. I advise you to go to the Colby Center and look at any and all of their work. You can find them on YouTube. There's also a proper website where there's papers and more academic stuff available there as well. I do not in any way work for the Colby Center. I'm associated with them at all, but they are the best source of information on defense of traditional Christian cosmology, and of a concerted takedown of evolution, and especially of theistic evolution, the idea that we can, in the church, hold on to an evolutionary cosmology and anthropology and still remain faithful to the gospel. Let me give the principal example that he gives, and I take no credit for this whatsoever, but grant it all to Hugh Owen and to the other people that work with him at the Colby Center. So just a quick look at a summary of an argument that is commonly given at the Colby Center on in their material, and it is a as you'll see, a fundamental argument in favor of creation and against theistic evolution. And it's based on, the argument, shall we say, I don't have a clever Latin translation of it right here, but the argument is the argument from the character of God, and I've initially written here the macro intention, or the overarching energy, even we could call it, anything to do with the nature of becoming. And any argument that talks about things being, first becoming and then continuing in being, has to be an argument addressing the manifold energies that are behind existence. And this is increasingly the case, as I've said before, and is nothing new to me, obviously, that matter is seen increasingly as an energetic in its substance, rather than material in its substance. And that's a whole other complex of argument. But still, any time we're looking at how did things come into being, well, what is the overarching intention? There has to be some kind of intention, whether it's conscious or not. It's still effort forward, leading to both the continuation and the meaningful, even if we say it's only us arbitrarily defining meaning to it, the meaningful transformation of and becoming of things. And that's the evolution is, in fact, a statement about the meaningful becoming of things. Because if it wasn't meaningful, then these organisms would all die out. Their meaning is, their fitness is the being of their meaning, as it were. So when we're talking about macro intention, we'll talk about character then. Now, in this case, we aren't arguing the difference between creation and atheistic evolution. Those here were arguing against theistic evolution. Both creation, special creation, ex nihilo creation, and theistic evolution are views held by Christians, held by people who are making a claim about how God went about bringing the world into being. One takes it simply as divine revelation, that it was given to us in a short but beautiful passage at the beginning of Scripture, and in other places in Scripture too, where it's recounted, and other fragments of mentionings of how God made things in both in Scripture and in the writings of the mystics. So we're talking about the character of God as creator, and the character of God as in terms of evolution. So we have the macro intention, which we're describing as well the character of God, under the two views of how God brought the world into being, either through special creation, ex nihilo, or through some process of cosmological and biological evolution. And we see the differences here in terms of the macro intention, or the character of the maker. So these two should not be seen as these columns running down here. This is the heading, and then this now becomes the subheading. This is the subject we're talking about, the macro intention, or the character of the maker. And we're now going to talk about this intention as it can be seen under both creation and under evolution. And we see that under creation, well, what is the larger view, the broad view of the nature of God under creation? Well, it's creative. In other words, it's and by this we mean we see the plenum of variety in creation. I mean, creation could have been quite simple. It doesn't need to have the endless variety we see in nature. It seems to be the very notion of the variation on a theme, as we know in music, seems to be the very nature in which God creates. And we see that it's rational. It works together, as I mentioned before, and will continue to mention. If you want to see an indication of the rational substance of existence, just look at the periodic table. It is a perfectly rational system. In fact, there was a time in which not all the elements had been found, but there were spaces in the periodic table based on atomic weight, and based on the basic structure of the atomic theory, with the quantities of protons and electrons and such, that there were two elements missing, and those two elements were then later discovered. So we have a rational, a creative, exceedingly rational state of being, and we'll look at this even more with the work on gravity, that we're looking at a rational will, in fact, in gravity. And will, meaning, I think sometimes we forget that being itself requires energy, moment by moment by moment, to exist. There's nothing necessarily inherent in material being to supply itself with the will to be. And we see the progression of nature, the continuance of nature, the act of creation to begin with, that in this we can see this kind of triune description of the macro intention, or the character of the Maker. We have the creative element can be seen as the Father. The rational element can be seen perhaps as the Son, the divine Logos, the word spoken of the Father, which then enacts as the Holy Spirit the will of the divine triune Creator. So we have a very nice, very satisfying conceptually, and a beautiful understanding of the world here under creation, that God makes things in this way. And under evolution, well, what do we have? Well, we have the inverse of all these things. We don't have creation, we have random. There is no conscious desire it just kind of shows up. We have no rationality. We in fact have meaninglessness, even though there is reason, such as in the periodic table. It's just the way it is. In order for there to be stuff, it had to be organized somehow. It's a very unsatisfying and quite unsophisticated understanding of being. And then it only just continues to be by some accident. There's no will behind it, no conscious will. I mean, this all speaks of consciousness. And this is trying, in a sense, to state the wares of this obvious consciousness as if it weren't conscious, as if it weren't creative, as if it weren't rational, as if it weren't willful in this way. Random, meaningless accident. And the method of this Creator, so this is the macro intention, the character of the Maker. What is the method? What is the process we see in these two different methods of creation, the difference between, or of two different methods of things becoming? We have, under creation, we have creation of the being of things coming into being perfect and entire and at once. There is no need for them to develop, though there is plasticity in being. It seems that biological beings have to have some amount of plasticity in terms of from generation to generation and how they manifest. In terms of phenotype, the genotype can manifest in various variations of phenotype in order to cope with changes in environment, that you couldn't have a rigid biological being. So this fluidity, this somewhat plasticity within range. I mean, a human being is always going to be a human being. A cat is always going to be a cat, but we see this possibility in plasticity sometimes within the removing of gene expression, and that is, I believe, the most common. And again, consult the Colby Center. They've done a great deal of work on this. Versus the evolution. If God is creator, this is all nice and neat and tidy and orderly in keeping with his divine character. If evolution is God's process, well, it appears to be random, meaningless accident. And we must conform to this idea if we're going to be having theistic evolution, because it's theistic Darwinism is what we're trying to have over on this side. And it is through endless mutation and death. That is a statement about the character of God that is denigrating, degrading, to a point that we really must shudder at the thought that we may have thought this of our Maker and the process of his making. When he's given us a clear story of how he did it, we've decided that because of reasons we need to adopt this in order to stay current, back here. Because the transfer of the institutions, in order for us to stay in the institutions and be considered something other than ignorant, fearful, so that we aren't left to being just some outcast, we've had to go through all this process. And look at the cost. The cost is how we understand the character of our Maker, his macro intention. Under creation, it's pristine, it's beautiful, it's cohesive, it's creative, it's rational, it's willful. Under theistic evolution, God uses endless mutation and death to bring about the pinnacle of his creation, which is indeed man. All the church fathers said this. They speak of man in a way that some of us might find somewhat uncomfortable. But they also speak that the only way for man to reach his true nobility is for man to be greatly humbled. But the God made man as the pinnacle of his creation. That is only true here, through creation. It's not true here. This is such a convoluted mess, and it is unnecessary to believe it. I know this is an argument, a theological argument as to why we would want to reject evolution and how we should not be able to accept it. I realize that's not necessarily going to be satisfactory to somebody who's not a Christian. But this is an in-house argument. This is not an argument outside of the house trying to make a convincing argument, although this argument should be quite convincing because it conforms with the real better than this does. This takes all the meaningful being of our world and just insists that it's an accident because it doesn't want to believe this. There's no good reason to believe this anymore. Evolution has run its course, and it only continues out of inertia, and sadly it continues out of inertia in its theistic form, and the effects that has had on theology and so forth. This synodal church that we hear about now coming out of Rome, this is an evolutionary church. It is not a creation church. It is not a divine revelation church. It is a becoming awareness, immanent church. See the difference? It's a huge difference. And there's one last thing I want to do on this video. And that was when I was talking about that there were, this supposed victory that was wrought by it. In the Reformation, I have a continued discussion about this victory of Copernicus, or I should say at least the upsetting that Copernicus brought. And it's taken to be the seed of understanding that we have a heliocentric cosmos, and therefore the deposition or the deposition of man as being the center, the earth as being the center, and so forth. And this then leads to essentially the elevation of man, ironically. But we have, in Copernicus, discovers nothing that necessarily needs to lead us to this down the road that we later went down. There are other events that will lead to that. Copernicus's discovery is that the energies of the orbits, of the motions of the planets, is most clearly understood as having the sun as being the focus of that, or the origin of those orbital movements. And this is quite well borne out by observation. But what Copernicus does not say and cannot say, because these are just mere observations, is what is the actual energy of those motions. So Copernicus is neutral, Copernicus is not, oh, a gotcha, we know this. And Hildegard von Bingen had a vision, and in her vision of creation, she saw that the planets orbited the sun, and the sun orbited the earth. And there is nothing by way of reason that says this cannot be the organization. And she had this vision before Copernicus discovered that the planets orbit the sun in this way. So this idea that he's discovered something that can't be, that necessarily implies something about the sun being, that the earth is somehow subordinate to the sun, is in no way necessarily understood. Only it's when you're concerned about the movement of bodies in terms of their weight by some natural force, and that's what comes in here. We have Newtonian naturalism. Now, if you want to see the cosmos and all of its masses, its objects, the planets and such, and their movements in terms of material movement by a material force, needing a material cause for their motions, then you would have to argue the most efficient motions are the necessary motions. But this isn't the case. There is no reason to believe that the planets move by some material force. Newton himself didn't even clearly make this claim. He makes some association between mass and orbits, but he in no way says, he in fact in the Principia says quite the opposite. He says that, and I mentioned this in the previous video and in the book, he talks only of centers of gravity and motions towards those points, such as the center of Earth or the center of the sun or the center of the moon. But he says he gives no hypothesis as to the cause of those motions. He does in the Principia make a formula fragment based on what has now become the gravitational formula. But he in no way ascribes even that to be causal. Well, we might as well read directly from Newton himself on the matter rather than just generically quoting him, so you understand that I'm not just sort of riffing here entirely on my own fantasy conceptions. This is a brief passage from page 7 of my book, The Restoration, and in it I'm quoting the Principia, Newton's magnum opus on physics. Newton's understanding of the gravitational effect is quite circumspect, as we see in this passage from Book 1, Definition 8, Paragraph 5 of the Principia. I likewise call attractions and impulses, in the same sense, accelerative and motive, and use the words attraction, impulse, or propensity of any sort towards a center promiscuously and indifferently, one for another, considering those forces not physically but mathematically. Wherefore the reader is not to imagine that by those words I anywhere take upon me to define the kind or the manner of any action, the causes or the physical reason thereof, or that I attribute forces in the true and physical sense to certain centers which are only mathematical points, when at any time I happen to speak of centers as attracting or as endued with attractive powers. My emphasis. So we see here that Newton is making a clear disclaimer about his language. He knows he's going to use language that speaks as if there is effort towards these things, but he's making it very clear because he's talking about things moving, and it's just the natural way to speak about these things. But what he's making clear is that he makes no physical claim, but only a mathematical claim. And we can see the difference between physicality and mathematics as the difference between physics and metaphysics. So that Newton is the intellectual father of naturalism and of a physical cause of the motions of things is not well founded. I mean, I know he does make a formula based on mass, a formula which I showed to be not a good description of the force of gravity. This is not to detract from anything else or even all else that is to be found in the Principia. It is a brilliant book. Sorry, I was cut out, but getting back. So we see that he makes a disclaimer that he's not making a physical, but a metaphysical claim only for the motions of things. He's only making a mathematical claim. It's a kind of, by saying mathematical, he's putting himself in a safer place than saying he's not attributing it to God directly, though he does elsewhere in his writing attribute creation and the motions of the planets to divine energy, saying that there's no way in which they of themselves could continue to move unaided. I do not have that direct quote, I'm sorry, right here. But so this brings us back to Newtonian naturalism as a part of the merits of the secular scientific ascendancy. It actually does not fit in very well as a victory because, first of all, Newton did not actually himself make the claims that are said to have been made. And will not show now, but this is what we're doing this preparation for, is to show that the naturalism, that the very formula of naturalism, mutual mass attraction, is not a successful explanatory model for the ontology of gravity. And that is shown in my work, and as I say, that's why we're doing this preparatory work. That I don't expect anyone to accept just on my statement, but there is plenty of evidence for that in other parts of my work. But in this moment here, we can say that Newton himself did not endorse this claim. He did not, in fact, found this naturalism, but it was his formula of mutual mass attraction was run with. And so that formula and that concept has to actually function for that to become a merit. Otherwise, it's not a merit of the scientific ascendancy if, in fact, Newtonian naturalism initially was not actually stated by Newton. And secondly, what was taken from Newton to mean something else actually fails as a concept. And building upon the Newtonian naturalism, we have come to this Einsteinian relativity and the warped time-space, and I won't get into that in too much detail here. And there was a break or dropout in my recording, and so this has been an infill video, and I carry on the conversation about Einsteinian relativity here in the next clip, and I just point the viewer to my videos here on Einstein's blunder for a more thorough critique of Einsteinian relativity. Takes a look at Einstein's initial argument of somebody dropping a stone from the train embankment and the two views of that event that follows from the dropping of the stone, or that proceeds forth in time and space from the dropping of the stone to create the conditions for his notions of relativity and special relativity, which are erroneous, I'll say. And if you look at the rather tedious work that I've done in Relativity Revisited and the somewhat careful work I've done on the videos, which is the seed work for a further work, if the good Lord permits me to continue in this work, or to have time to work on that. It's not necessary to my overall work. It's, in a sense, a side job at this, or a side effort at this point, but it intrigues me, so I'm interested in having a look at it further. But the very notion of relativity is that we've lived in, and which has been a continuation of this kind of confusion of contemporary man, that, you know, everything's relative, man. Like it's not a well-founded, in fact, it's not a founded view whatsoever. That in fact, absolute time and space, Newtonian space-time, is actually consistent. That space and time are consistent and continuous throughout, that they are equidistant, equimeasured. There's an equal measurement in time and space throughout space-time. There's no reason to suppose otherwise, and that it is this regularity of space-time that allows for relativity to take place. And if you want a further look at that, look at the videos Einstein's Blunder, or have a look at my book, Relativity Revisited, the links for which will be at the end of this video. Anyway, I'll say that's enough for now. That's quite a bit of add-on to this discussion we had, but I just thought I should make this case a little bit clearer and show that this victory, this supposed victory, the merits of secular scientific ascendancy, is not really well-founded. That there was never really a clear victory. There was a desire for this to be true. And men like Voltaire and even Kant said that he was going to do in philosophy what was done in cosmology by Copernicus, because he had an understanding of Copernicus that was through this tradition of not necessarily Newton himself, but through the Newtonian tradition of Newtonian naturalism, the materialism, the material monad of that, which has now led to more esoteric forms of the same thing, but always keeping us principally at the primacy of matter against the primacy of the divine. And we have been, as I will repeat again, far too willing to cast our pearls away and just feed with the swine. And this is not a thing that is going to bring about the restoration of and the revival of the church from this time of great apostasy. Anyway, that's that for now. I think that may be the end of lesson 1. Oh no, one last thing I want to do, which I may get to tomorrow, and just to make a simpler case for perceptual realism, and then that work having been established, I can then return to the work on gravity, having established the basic principle of, I mean, this is a pretty standard approach when doing any kind of philosophical work. You need to back all the way up to the beginning to decide what it is you're saying epistemologically, and how you're saying it. What's your epistemological criteria? And I've been defending a realist view of knowledge, a realist view of perception, a realist view of all of these issues, and that's the criteria I'm laying down, and I hope that I've done so in a reasonable fashion. So any feedback would be greatly appreciated. And I'm going to Teleologic Jones signing out. God bless, and we'll see you next time.